Hello everybody! Under my last video I was asked to make an iceberg meme format list of leftist ideologies. So I did. Please note that the order here doesn't tell you whether I like or dislike an ideology. It's about how commonly known they are. So don't you ask why communist nihilism is lower than Stalinism. It's my guess of the popularity. So stay tuned until the end for some of the weirdest concepts you've ever heard of. I think. And if you like historical, political and leftist topics, you may like my entire channel, so why not add some of my suggested videos on the queue thing, or even subscribe directly. That being said, let's get going. First, political spectrum fan. Marxism. This is the most basic and one of the earliest ideologies of most modern leftism. It describes the beliefs of Karl Marx, which include but are not limited to workers being exploited according to the labor theory of value, which I got an entire video on, society being in an unsolvable conflict, which I have more than one video on, because it's dialectic materialism, and that ultimately a workers' revolution will overthrow capitalism and replace it with socialism, which just means that instead of rich people running the trade and industry, the workers themselves do it. Which is neat if you like individual freedom. Nothing more liberating than running your own workplace democratically. Leninism. Leninism can be seen as a further development from Marxism. While Marx wanted the revolution to be spontaneously started by the workers, which would need lots of class-conscious people, or by a central state guided by workers, depending on when you talk to Marx, Leninism was designed for a party called the Vanguard to take power even if the workers aren't class conscious yet because of a lack of industry, like in, let's say, Imperial Russia. That vanguard will take over the state, protect the revolution and develop the industry until the workers could take over and reach socialism. When this step takes place is a big question mark. Maoism. Maoism is often seen as the further developed adaptation of Leninism. It was made to take a poor, exploited colonized country, like China during Mao's time, and implement Leninist ideas. The issue was that foreign capitalists would crush the leftist movements, so Mao allied with the farmers and the local capitalists, neither of which are technically working class, and he planned to let the capitalists develop the industry instead of the state itself doing it, before then taking the economy over using the workers' state, which should give all power to the workers. Stalinism. When Lenin eventually did what all people do and died, his vanguard state was taken over by Stalin, who changed course. Stalinism is not an ideology as such, it's more just a word used to describe what Stalin did. Under Stalin, the USSR went from international revolution to socialism in one country. They became more militarized, especially when defending against Nazi Germany, and the position of the General Secretary was made more powerful, officially to fight factionalism and disunity. Also, the purges and gulags and stuff. Trotskyism. Of course, some people had issues with all that, so they criticized Stalin for the direction he took the USSR. Namely, it was Trotsky and his faction, who eventually had to flee the country. He continued to criticize everything Stalin did and even set up his own international, which is basically like making a global alliance against Stalin's global alliance. Trotsky was eventually killed by Stalin's assassins. Until today, many wonder whether Trotsky would have done better than Stalin, and when Trotskyists will stop creating new internationals. Anarcho-communism. On the completely other end of the leftist spectrum to the Leninists, you will find the anarchists. Anarchism is of course an attempt to create a society without unjust power structures. This means no political representatives or capitalists like we have them now, and a lot more political participation from everyone. Naturally, socialism fits perfectly with this whole no power structure thing, since workers run the factories and trade. So almost all anarchists realize that the only way to reach a world without unjust power structure is through people's revolution and abolishing the capitalist class. And the state, which is what causes disagreements between anarchists and Leninists. They're on opposite ends of the state argument. Second, Lefttube watcher. Mutualism. Mutualism is a term in biology that describes two or more organisms working together for the profit of all of them. Anarchist or political mutualism is based on a similar principle. The goal is a world without hierarchy and exploitation. For that, the workers own the factories. They get exactly as much labor as they invested, sometimes through labor vouchers. And the banks operate on practically no interest to help the workers fund new businesses. This was one of the first anarchist ideologies, and it was made far before Marx, which is why it uses a free market to help trade between factories. The issues of market economies were not nearly as obvious back then as they are now. Syndicalism. A newer form of anarchism is syndicalism. In this one, the unions will both take over the economy and then govern it. The unions, which are supposed to represent the workers as closely as possible, would stage a general strike and take over the industry of either the nation or the world, sometimes with and sometimes without guns. Then the unions would decide what to produce where, how to get it to the place it needs to be, and so on. This is in theory more democratic than state-controlled economies, since the unions are usually run bottom-up, while parties are more top-down. Luxemburgism. No, this is not the ideology of Luxembourg, the country, it's the ideology of Rosa Luxemburg, the Marxist. Luxemburgism crystallized around the same time as Leninism did, so that was around World War I. Luxemburg believed that there should never be a party leading the dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead, it must be completely led by councils and the workers themselves. Luxemburg was also very anti-war, which was rare in Germany during World War I. Eventually, she was shot by Freikorps soldiers around the time of the November Revolution. Eco-communism. Eco-communism or eco-socialism are ideologies which seek to unite environmental protection and Marxist goals. Because many Marxist ideologies like Leninism and Maoism put technological and economic progress above the environment, doing things like building heavy industry and giving people petrol cars. Eco-socialism has its roots in the 80s, like most environmental movements. So it has not been implemented anywhere so far, but in theory it has goals like lots of public transportation, green energy, organic food, and so on. Anti-revisionism. If you're an online leftist, you probably heard about revisionism before. Possibly you were called a revisionist. But what does that mean? Well, when Stalin died, Khrushchev took power, and he changed the official party line, especially on Stalin's actions. So while the official USSR government said that Stalin's re-education camps, aka gulags, were good, now it suddenly changed or revised that position. And people who oppose this retroactive changing of doctrine are called anti-revisionists. A lot of the time they're Stalinists trying to defend Stalin against Khrushchev's criticisms. But technically any form of changing history after the fact is called revisionism. So it's not always a bad thing. Egoism. Egoism is another form of anarchism. It's heavily influenced by philosophical egoism, in which you focus on yourself, aka your ego, first. The idea is that all that matters is that yourself can achieve what it wants to. Of course, working with other people and respecting them can help you achieve things. But institutions like the state, property, and capital, which limit what you can do, are enemies of egoism. It's not a classical form of anarchism as such, it's not based on Proudhon, but effectively egoism opposes the same things anarchists oppose, so they work together and are often lumped together. Third, political compass enjoyer. Illegalism. Very closely related to egoism, you will find illegalism. It crystallized around the year 1900. As the name would suggest, illegalists embrace lifestyles based on criminality, either openly or secretly. The idea is that laws and morality in a capitalist society are bad because they prevent you from doing what your ego wants to. The criminal activity is usually something like theft, squatting, or shoplifting. Those are supposed to sabotage the capitalist system and harm it as a form of resistance against contemporary society, which, frankly, I don't think would destroy capitalism. Queer anarchism. Anarchism itself, as you now know, is about having no power structures where possible, so people can do and decide their own life. Some anarchists want to include things like LGBT identities to this, so anyone should be able to love or marry anyone or to pick their gender identity themselves. Other anarchists disagree with this and want to focus on economic liberation, so queer anarchism describes those who are anarchists with an emphasis on LGBT liberation. All queer anarchists are anarchists, but not all anarchists are queer anarchists. Green anarchism. Green anarchism is almost exactly the same but for the environment. It's a subgroup of anarchists who put a special emphasis on environmental protection. This is important because a lot of anarchist ideologies like mutualism and syndicalism plan to massively expand the industry, which could harm the natural ecosystem. Green anarchists want to keep the environment safe. Like queer anarchism, this is a subgroup, so all green anarchists are anarchists, but not all anarchists are green anarchists. Fully automated luxury communism. In 2019, Aaron Bastini wrote a book titled Fully Automated Luxury Communism, which is about this dream world in which automatization made all human labor necessary, and anyone can receive anything they need for close to no cost at all. This was critically received because not everyone believes that automatization will ever reach that level, like myself. It's a cool dream though. International socialism. Also known as proletarian internationalism, this is a tendency that rejects concepts like leftist nationalism or socialism in one country, and instead wants to have all workers of the world work together towards a workers' revolution. This means supporting socialist parties around the world, financially, economically, and if needed militarily. The idea is that all workers of the world fight the same battle, so they should be united, and letting capitalists control part of the globe will only give them a chance to strike back at the achievements of socialist countries. Titoism. Titoism was the ideology of Josip Broz Tito, who was the ruler of Yugoslavia during most of the Cold War. He is notable because he was one of the few Cold War-era socialist states not to listen to the USSR. The Soviet Union wanted all countries to adopt their ideas of centrally planning and one-party states. Instead, Tito organized a market-style economy in which factories were run by their workers, not a government organ. Defying the will of the USSR meant Tito spent a lot of time dodging Soviet assassination plots, and most interestingly, Yugoslavia, despite being socialist, was seen as neutral during the Cold War. Hoxhanism. Hoxhanism was the ideology of Enver Hoxha, who ruled Albania for a long time during the Cold War. Just like most leftist ideologies, Hoxhanism developed when there was a fight between slightly different types of leftists. In this case, Albania and China. It ended with Albania declaring China revisionist, and it led to Albania relentlessly defending Stalin, even though every other country had adopted the Khrushchev line by this point. They were also really obsessed with building millions of bunkers, supposedly to defend against those slightly different leftists. Fourth, Leftvalues taker. Anarcho-collectivism. This ideology is an attempt to unite individualist anarchists like egoists and the collectivism that comes with many Marxist-originated ideologies. So, anarcho-collectivists want to abolish the state and private property and replace them with collectively owned means of production. Nowadays, almost all anarchists are anarcho-collectivists. Very few mutualists remain. Anarcho-pacifism. Anarcho-pacifists are a subgroup of anarchists that oppose all violence, even as part of a revolution. They view the use of violence as inherently part of a power structure, which I guess makes sense. You are exercising power when being violent. And instead they advocate for peaceful means of reaching anarchism, like dual power, which I explained 2 videos ago. Best of luck to them, I suppose. Platformism. Platformism is an anarchist ideology created after the fall of Magnovia, which was an anarchist experiment during the Russian Civil War. The idea is to, instead of a broad anarchist revolution, establish a small party of ideologically pure anarchists that would then attempt to move the masses to anarchism. Naturally, all anarchists see this and identify it as a party, which they oppose because it has power structures between the party and the common person at least. So this ideology never found mass appeal. Left communism. As you know, communism is the furthest left it goes, except it's not. During the Cold War, most countries were Marxist-Leninists, and left communists consider that to be too far right, so they oppose it in favor of more classical Marxist ideas. This means more individual rights and more direct workers' control of the economy, along with smaller states and no more secret police. Classical Marxism. Classical Marxism is just another form of what I previously called Marxism. It's a term used by people who want to emphasize that they are part of the ideas of Marx as he wrote them, not Marxist-Leninists or other newer forms of Marxism developed in the past 150 years. Fifth, leftist YouTuber. Post-anarchism. Post-anarchists are anarchists who don't really listen to the old traditional forms of anarchism, like syndicalism, but instead they focus on the anarchist movements since the Second World War. This is why it's also sometimes called contemporary anarchism. Their methods are things like anti-globalization and peace activism, squatting and student protest movements. You could see them as the new generation of anarchists. Anarchism without adjectives. This is a form of anarchism which basically tries to create unity among anarchist movements. We heard about many forms of anarchism already, and this movement seeks to unite them all under one umbrella while letting them all focus on issues important to them. It's an attempt at far left unity, but only for anarchists. Posadism. This ideology is named after Latin American socialist Juan Posad. He was a Trotskyist, so like a real leader, he called a new international. His beliefs are hard to pin down because of all the memes people make about it, but the legends say that he thought socialism can only be achieved after a nuclear war, which makes sense since this is the 60s. He allegedly believed that socialist aliens would visit Earth once we become socialists, and also dolphins. Apparently. Juche. Juche is the ideology of North Korea, which makes it interesting because it still exists right now. Juche is about every country being self-sufficient and not relying on others at all for anything, from politics to military. Juche also really likes the Kim family that rule North Korea, a bit like monarchs. Yes, in a past video I tried to argue that North Korea is not actually a monarchy. I hereby take it back, you can call it what you want. Maoism, Third Worldism. This is about combining orthodox Marxist ideas, Mao's theories, and Third Worldism, which very basically is a concept that attempts to explain the poverty in the Third World. Classical examples are globalization, exploitation, late effects from colonialism, and way more. They synthesize these modern concepts with old ideas of revolution brought back from Mao, based on the theories of Marx. Centrist Marxism. This is a form of Marxism that sits in between reformists and revolutionaries. They advocate for both at the same time. So, while handing out flyers for the election, they also talk radical stuff with those willing to revolution, which to me seems like the obvious way to do it, but apparently not. Interestingly, if you saw my video on revolution, I'm definitely a centrist Marxist, interestingly enough. Sixth. What? Barracks communism. This was a concept Karl Marx made up. The barracks refer to cheap workers' housing, not military. It's a form of communism, or better said socialism, in which there is a crude authoritarian government that force collectivizes land and where all aspects of life are controlled by the government. Interestingly, Marx hated the idea of that and only used this word to describe the ideas of others, not himself. Turns out Karl Marx did not support 1984. Autonomism. Also called autonomous Marxism, autonomism is an ideology from the 60s heavily influenced by anarchists. The idea is that a socialist region can only succeed if the workers have the most possible autonomy. This means no central planning and sometimes no state at all. Instead, those affected by decisions should be the ones to make them. It's basically anarchism, but keeps a few Marxist concepts related to economic analysis, And yes, this ideology is trying to undo the split of the First International 160 years later. Good luck. Nihilist communism. Nihilism is very basically the belief that nothing has a point, there's nothing inherently good or bad about life and such things. A Frenchman named Monsieur Dupont wrote an entire manifesto trying to make the communists less optimistic, titled Nihilistic Communism, a Critique of Optimism. The only good thing about it is that it wants to disregard the works of established writers like Marx and Lenin to try to find its own principles on which to base the highly pessimistic form of communism which they propose. Ceausescu. Ceausescu was the dictator of communist Romania for almost its entire existence. Much like Stalinism, it's not an official ideology, but more of a term for what the guy did. Stuff like national communism, which is self-explanatory. Also decided that there should be an intermediate stage between capitalism and Leninist transitionary states. Yes, a transition state to transition to a transition state. Also, when the people protested for more rights, he ordered them all to be shot. Gorbachevism. This ideology is like the last one. Not a true ideology, but more of a term of the loosely connected things we call Gorbachev's policies. The ideology is about opening state socialist countries up to markets, privatizing all businesses and destroying the quality of life, betraying socialist allies, appearing in a Pizza Hut commercial and destroying the USSR. Mao Spontex. Mao Spontex was an idea in the 60s and 70s. It's about Mao-style revolution in the Third World, and the core belief is that there's no way to start a revolution. It must be a spontaneous uprising. Spontex is short for spontaneously. Mao spontaneity. Besides sounding funny, this is a really boring one. Vikiism. The last one. Vikiism. This weird leftist YouTuber decided that they're important enough to make up their own ideology in a 20-minute YouTube videos. And their ideology is just the best one in the world, if I'm honest with you. That being said, that is the video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your attention span, which made it all the way through this video, which should mean that you should subscribe, because it definitely means that you like the stuff I upload every week. And if you've been watching for a while, why not donate a bit on Patreon? This is my official job now. I need money to exist. Special thanks to Theon Hartley, Potato God 777, Alan Vogt, Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, V, Sandra Corvus, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, Comrade Falcon, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Curazelli, DSM5 is better than ICD-10, Emily Margot Klassen, Evie Wren, Finn Gould, Herdina, Josh C, Klastrup, Liam S, Lilith Craft, Mamuka Ziliari, Marxism Tonight, Nana Epema, Poach, Rama Deville, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Taylor CH, Sleron Gilliard Jr., and Trey.